that changes in information processes and systems may be enablers and diagnostic features, but they are not the main drivers. They may be necessary, but not sufficient. Likewise, reproductive individuality is also diagnostic, but it is not the main causal agency, and it's not even universal, and I'll get to that. As I've proposed in various publications, it's functional or economic innovations that are cooperatively produced and their consequences for survival and reproduction that are of far greater importance. I believe the primary causal agency in a major transition is a new form or level of organization in terms of size, functional specialization, i.e. a division of labor, new biotechnologies, and economic interdependence or a shared fate, which depends on otherwise unattainable new forms of synergistic functional effects that are advantageous in the struggle for life, as Darwin termed it. Accordingly, the short answer to question 2, how do we explain the major transitions in evolution, is that in every case it involved new forms of functional synergy in a dynamic that John Maynard Smith called synergistic selection. Functional synergies of various kinds have played an important causal role in shaping the trajectory of biological evolution. Novel functional benefits are the key. Each new unit of cooperative functional organization and selection could thus be characterized as, first and foremost, a more inclusive and potent collective survival enterprise. It's now widely recognized that cooperation has played a co-starring role in the evolutionary process. Indeed, biologist Richard Michaud claims that, quote, cooperation is now seen as the primary creative force behind ever greater levels of complexity and organization in all of biology. And Martin Nowak characterizes cooperation as, quote, the master architect of evolution. Yes, but it's not cooperation per se that has been the creative force or the architect. Rather, it's the functional synergies, the unique combined effects produced by cooperation. Synergies of various kinds have been the underlying cause of cooperation and complexity in evolution, not the other way around. As I say in my 2018 book on this subject titled Synergistic Selection, How Cooperation Has Shaped Evolution and the Rise of Humankind, cooperation may have been the vehicle, but synergy was the driver. As for question 3, as you know, there's been much debate about whether or not the evolution of humankind represents a distinct major transition which transcends that of other superorganisms like leafcutter ants. Some theorists hold that human evolution qualifies on the basis of the unique role of verbal language and culture. I would prefer to characterize such major changes in information systems as major inventions and reserve the term major transition, again, for a distinct new form of functional organization. I happen to agree that human evolution does represent a major transition, but I maintain that this is based on the unique nature of human societies as quintessentially cooperative economic systems based on coalitions of individual families, separate reproductive units, for the purpose of achieving various collective economic benefits, rather than being organized around a segregated, specialized reproductive system. In effect, it represents a social contract, though it's reinforced, of course, by our evolved social psychological traits and our culture. Because it's driven by new technological and economic synergies, moreover, this novel kind of purely economic, social, and political system has been open-ended in size and scope. Being functionally based, it has been able to expand relatively rapidly in evolutionary time into multi-leveled systems, both nested and hierarchical, that span entire continents and contain populations that may exceed 1 billion members, a feat no other socially organized species has yet achieved, needless to say. All this is discussed in some detail in my 2018 book, so I'll leave it at that. Finally, there's the question for my current work in this workshop: is the human species undergoing yet another major transition? In the context of accelerating climate changes and other serious environmental challenges, there is a widespread recognition that we are rapidly altering the biosphere of our planet and that our species may be in peril. One extreme scenario for the ultimate outcome of this trend is the virtual extinction of our species, an ecological apocalypse, if you will. I have a different view of the matter. In my forthcoming new book, Superorganism, A New Social Contract for Our Endangered Species, I conclude that the jury is still out on our future. We are at a fork in the road where the choices we make collectively or not will shape the future direction not only of our own species, but very likely the entire evolutionary process. I believe that the fundamental problem we face is not technological, but political, a problem of governance and collective action and vision. So let me briefly summarize the argument. Imagine this future scenario. It's the year 2050 and the long predicted mega drought spanning more than 8 states in the American Southwest and northern Mexico is now in its second decade. There have been similar droughts like this in the past, and the prediction is that it could last for 50 to 100 years. Half the regional population, some 25 million people, have been forced to evacuate and have become climate refugees. The drought has also decimated a major part of that country's agricultural system, and food prices worldwide have skyrocketed. Indeed, the whole US economy has been devastated by what is being called the ultimate recession. Elsewhere in the world in 2050, the relentless decline in glaciers and winter snowpacks and a sharp reduction in the water runoff that feeds many of the world's major rivers has caused severe shortages in food production and water supplies across a growing number of countries, while sustained drought conditions have affected large swaths of Asia, Europe, Russia, North Africa, and even Canada and the Midwestern American Farm Belt. A global struggle for survival is now underway, and hundreds of millions of people will starve. This dark scenario, of course, is a fantasy, but the odds are that something along these lines, or perhaps worse, will happen sooner rather than later if we remain on our present course as a divided and deeply competitive aggregation of individual countries that are focused on their own self-interests and on maintaining their autonomy. The recent surge in polarizing nationalism, coupled with the closing of doors against one another, is an especially disturbing sign. Our global civilization has failed on the whole to respond effectively to our growing survival crisis. There is a proverbial hangman's noose tightening around the neck of the human species. As I detail in the book, it's a doomsday rope with several deadly strands in addition to climate warming. However, I believe there is an alternative. We still have a chance to create a sustainable global society based on cooperation and mutually beneficial interdependence, a global superorganism. Positive synergy is the key, just as it always has been, the driver of our evolution as a species. But this in turn will require the replacement of an individualistic, competitive, nationalistic social ethic with new social and political values and a sublimation of our global economic system to the ancient principle of the common good. In other words, we must reverse the ominous current trend toward increased division and conflict in world politics and extreme inequality in our economies. I don't need to tell this audience that the greatest threat we may face is each other and a regression into tribalism and violent social conflict. As you well know, organized warfare has been one of the major themes in human history, going as far back as we can see. It's long been a part of our problem-solving toolkit as a species. Going forward, we face the very real prospect of a pandemic of climate wars or worse. Equally important, the challenges we are facing will very often transcend national borders, from mega droughts to lethal disease epidemics and the growing horde of climate refugees. One incredible estimate from the World Bank is that there could be as many as 250 displaced people in the next 30 years. These crises will overwhelm the ability of many countries to deal with them unaided. So we have only 2 paths going forward. We must either create a more effective global superorganism, or else our species will very likely be convulsed by lethal conflict and perhaps even devolve and go extinct. Only an organized process of major social, economic, and political change on a global scale offers us genuine reason for hope. Our species is already unique in many ways, but now we need to take the next step, the next major transition. In my book, I outline a plan and a roadmap for a more legitimate and sustainable economic and political world order. Among other things, it will require a new global social contract and effective global governance, along with many local initiatives and changes in every country. Equally important, there's a need for new agencies and programs, and especially much greater financial resources to deal more effectively with our environmental crisis, as well as investing in a major upgrade to our global infrastructure and responding to the ever-increasing menace of massive and prolonged climate disasters. I also propose in the book 2 new United Nations super agencies, a global infrastructure fund and a global emergency management agency, rather like FEMA in the United States. In addition, we have to rein in our capitalist economic system and subordinate it to the common good. Free market capitalism has been part of the problem. It must be enlisted to become part of the solution. And all of this must be accompanied by broad political reforms. Dysfunctional and corrupt governments seem to be endemic these days. One authoritative estimate is that more than 60 countries have sick governments. Effective governance on behalf of the principle of the public trust is also a key part of the solution. Let me just also briefly mention something that's probably very far afield for this workshop, but nevertheless, it might be of interest to you. The foundational proposal in my book for a new global social contract. I argue that social justice will be an essential enabler for the political changes that are being proposed, and that there are, in fact, 3 distinct fairness principles that play a vitally important role in all of our social relationships. They represent the goalposts, so to speak, for achieving a legitimate and fair society. These fairness principles are: first, equality with respect to providing for our basic survival needs. There should be a universal basic needs guarantee. Second, equity with respect to merit, or giving every man his due, as Plato put it in his treatise on social justice, The Republic. And third, reciprocity, or paying back for the benefits we receive from others in society. As I explain in the book, these 3 fairness principles, equality, equity, and reciprocity, must be bundled together and balanced in order to achieve a stable and relatively harmonious social order. It could be likened to a 3-legged stool. All 3 legs are equally essential. The well-known 20th century biologist Julian Huxley many years ago described humankind as evolution becoming conscious of itself. Now we must take the next step and consciously redirect the course of evolution. If we succeed, the next major transition in evolution would move beyond synergistic selection to teleonomic selection, with a nod to Lamarck and Professor Jablonka. To borrow another important theoretical concept in this workshop, it would involve a pre-planned and deliberately engineered new niche construction. I know full well that what I am proposing in my book is a very tall order, and the skeptics will respond that it's much too tall, totally unrealistic, even utopian. But just feel that tightening hangman's noose and consider the likely alternative. There's a spreading mood of gloom in some quarters these days about the environmental crisis. I call it the Doomsday Caucus. It includes a significant number of the world's scientists, as well as many mainstream environmental experts, professional writers, political activists, and many others who have given up hope that there can be any technological, economic, or political fixes for global warming and our ecological overshoot as a species. To these pessimists, the apocalypse is already baked in. Anything we do now is too little too late. I believe that such defeatism is a classic example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a great deal that can be done to prevent a full-scale Armageddon. I believe that nothing that doing everything we can to deal with the crisis is far better than doing nothing. I much prefer the risk of failure to the certainty of failure. To paraphrase a famous line from Samuel Johnson, nothing concentrates the mind like the prospect of being hanged in a fortnight. It's time for us to look ahead and concentrate our minds on our global hangman's noose. The difference between pessimism and hope depends entirely on the choices we make collectively or not. Starting now, later will be too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And are you willing to take some questions?
Well, sure. I'd be slightly surprised if there weren't questions, but you may or may not want to share them with me.
Okay. Let me ask the first question then. When you mentioned position in a human society in order to cope with environmental catastrophes, I understand.
I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but as usual, I'm having a great difficulty. I really can't understand what you're saying.
Let me say it again.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
It's pretty muffled, but let's try.
Okay, when you mention the next major transition, in order to cope with the environmental catastrophes, I take it that this means the transfer of responsibility from national governments to a global government, which supposedly becomes very powerful. Okay? Is that correct?
No, not exactly. It's complicated, and it took a whole chapter to explain it, but it has to be both a bottom-up and a top-down and a multi-leveled process. We have to do things as individuals, we have to do things as local and state and national governments, but there would be enhanced powers and resources, financial resources especially, that would become available to the international community as a whole. Yes, there would be an enhancement of the United Nations authority. I apply the Edmund Burke principle of incremental changes as being far more effective than revolutionary change as an instrumentality for bringing about changes like what we're talking about. And so what would be involved is really an incremental enhancement of the ability of the United Nations to intervene and assist other nations, but also to intervene in conflict and to prevent conflict and to reform dysfunctional governments or failed states. So it's an enhancement. It's not a philosopher king, top-down, benevolent dictatorship or anything of that sort. And it would also involve a self-government, a move toward the United Nations being more democratically self-governing. And there are a series of potential steps that can be done. It's a rather complicated scenario.
Other questions? So I'll just make one comment, that in my nightmares, there is a global government that's very powerful.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I said that it is a nightmare for me to have a very powerful global government. I think one of the reasons that the Soviet Union collapsed is because they could watch the West and see that it can be done differently. But if the entire globe is under global government, there may be no refuge.
You are projecting a caricature that is absolutely the opposite of what I'm proposing in the book. And so all I can ask you to do is read it first before you pass any judgments. This is not about a hierarchical top-down all-powerful government. I describe it as being a set of negotiated social contracts among the individual nations that would retain their autonomy, but that would agree to participate in a set of collective and cooperative efforts. This would be definitely a self-governing bottom-up process as well. And just take it on faith at this point without assuming the worst. I'm as much afraid of that model as you are, and so that's why I've designed something very different.
Hello, Peter.
Hi, Arsh.
I have a question which really bugs me. Indeed, what you are portraying is seems to be a little bit utopistic to me.
A little what? What?
A little utopistic to me, right?
Utopia. Oh, yeah.
And actually, there could be this strange case that happens in certain cellular automata that you can have these states that are called Eden. And an Eden state in a cellular automaton is a self-maintaining configuration, but it has been proven that is unattainable from anywhere else, right? So once it is there by miracle, it maintains itself, but there is no path to that. So that's one worry. The second worry is about speed. I mean, I am quite deeply engaged with some colleagues about, you know, the dynamics of climate change, the nature of the tipping points, and so. So there is not much time to muck around. That's the problem, Peter. Don't you think?
Well, let me respond very briefly to both aspects of this. First, as I said in my talk, and as I say also in the book, that some people may perceive this as being utopian, but if you read it carefully, you will see that it is a very concrete and realizable plan. I've had feedback from people who spent their whole lives thinking about potential reform and improvement of the United Nations as an instrument, not the instrument, but as an instrument of the solving of global problems and helping us to achieve a viable future. And so this is only utopian in the sense that it may not be achievable, but it is not utopian in the sense of Plato's Philosopher King. In fact, I'm a great admirer of Plato's last work, The Laws, in which he laid out what he called the second best, realizing that a Philosopher King top-down hierarchical benevolent dictatorship model was not going to work. And he said the second best is a mixed government with all of the various interests involved under the rule of law. And that is, in fact, the system that we have been struggling with for the last 2,000 years to implement. So it is Plato's non-utopian solution that I adhere to. And that is reflected in the prescription that I have in the book. As for the timing, you are absolutely right. There is a detailed cover story in The Economist this week, which goes through in some detail what the consequences are of various measures to try to curtail global warming and or to implement sequestration of carbon dioxide. And the long and the short of it is that we have about 10 years to make major changes. Otherwise, the kind of environmental disruption that I've described begins to look much more realistic and much more immediate than would be the case otherwise. Time is very short, and so I'm not advocating that global government be something that we focus all of our attentions on. On the contrary, we need to focus on global warming first. And what I, in fact, propose in the book is that there needs to be more voluntary effort and more cooperative effort with the key nations like China, the United States, Russia, and others leading the way. And we didn't see that yesterday at the United Nations. After the inspiring speech by Greta Thunberg, there was silence on the part of the world's leaders. And that's very disturbing.
Peter, I would like to thank you on behalf of all the workshop participants. I believe that we all share your concerns, and this is seriously something that we would need to consider. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.